The hall had been built to compress people, Nikolai decided. The ceilings vaulted upward until the torchlight gave out, and the stone walls pressed inward at just the angle that made every person standing on the floor feel slightly smaller than they had at the door. She had spoken in cold rooms before, in lean-to meeting halls and mud-floored assemblies where her words were the only currency her settlement carried. She had never spoken in a room that seemed designed to swallow voices whole. She was standing below the witness rail when the Alpha King of the Aaron Hold turned his gaze across the assembled petitioners and found her. Not because she had done anything, not because she had spoken. Only because the air in the room shifted when his attention moved, the way a river changes its surface when the wind crosses it, and every person standing near her instinctively straightened or stepped back, and she was the one who did neither. She did not know yet that Soren, standing at the king's left shoulder, noticed her stillness and filed it somewhere behind his eyes. She did not know that a single quiet instruction would be issued before she reached her room that night, concerning her safety, concerning her access to water and a fire, concerning the detail of two guards whose posting she would never be able to explain. She knew only that the Alpha King's gaze had crossed her face and moved on, and that Elder Voss had already told the assembly her name and her station, and had placed her below the witness rail, which was the council's way of marking her as common-born and not worth the better seat. She was going to need to speak in this hall. Her settlement was counting on it. 3 days before she arrived at the Aaron Hold, the eastern settlement of Calwyn had sent her forward with a sealed petition, 7 signatures on a piece of cured hide, and a single instruction from the eldest of their number. Say what is true. The petition concerned grazing rights that had been quietly absorbed into the Hold's formal ledger over the course of 4 seasons, 60 acres of valley pasture that had fed Calwyn's herd since before any current council member had taken their seat. Nikolai had read the petition on the road, and then she had read it again, and she had arrived at the Hold's outer gate with the hide folded against her ribs and a precise understanding of exactly what she was going to need to say. She had not arrived expecting the hall to be this large, or the council to be this still, or the Alpha King to be the kind of man who made a room rearrange itself around his presence without raising his voice. She had not arrived expecting Elder Voss. He was the senior elder of the Aaron Council, which meant he had presided over tribute assemblies for long enough that he had developed a particular expression for petitioners below a certain standing. It was not contempt exactly, though contempt was inside it. It was the expression of a man who had already calculated the outcome of a situation and found the calculation so reliable that he saw no reason to attend to the process. He had looked at Nikolai when she gave her name and her settlement, and he had said, with the mild clarity of a man stating whether, that a petition speaker from Calwyn was of common birth and would be seated accordingly. Below the witness rail, where the echoes went first and the council members' eyes went last. Nikolai had taken the seat. She had learned, in 16 years of speaking for people who could not speak for themselves, that the seat she was given at the start of a proceeding was rarely the seat she held at the end of it. The first hour of any assembly was about posture and patience. She smoothed the petition against her knees and waited. Wren found her during the recess, slipping through a side corridor with a clay cup of something warm and a look of calculated calm that Nikolai recognized as the girl's version of worry. Wren was 15, small for it, and had been in Nikolai's charge since she was 9, when a border reorganization had left her without a household, and Nikolai had been the person standing closest to the gap. She had followed Nikolai from Calwyn to the Hold the way she followed her everywhere, 3 steps back, watching the angles, ready to be useful before she was asked. How many council members? Wren asked. 7 seated, Nikolai said. Voss chairs, the Alpha King presides but doesn't vote. What does he do then? Nikolai wrapped her hands around the cup and thought about the way Calder had sat in the high seat, the particular quality of his attention, the way the room had organized itself around him without any visible effort on his part. He decides, she said. She did not know, as she said it, how precisely that would matter. The afternoon session concerned 3 other petitions before hers. She listened to each of them with the attention she always gave to any proceeding she was part of, because you learned more from watching how a council treated other speakers than from any introduction or summary. The first petition was from a northern delegation with 2 named bloodlines in their ancestry, and Voss addressed their speaker by his formal title and offered him the standing lectern at the floor's center. The second petition was from a merchant family with a prior council relationship, and they were given water and a consultation recess. The third petition was from a shepherd community 2 valleys west of Calwen, and the shepherd speaker was a woman of middle years with calloused hands and good diction, and Voss interrupted her twice. Nikolai noted all of it. She noted something else as well, which was harder to name. At the second interruption of the shepherd speaker, the Alpha King's gaze had moved from the council table to Voss, and then to the speaker, and then back to Voss. And the motion had been very small, and had carried in it a quality of attention that was not approval. Voss had not looked at the high seat. Voss, she was coming to understand, did not look at the high seat as a habit, because men who have run proceedings long enough sometimes forget whose proceedings they are. She filed that understanding next to her petition. When they called her name, she rose from below the witness rail and walked to the floor's center without being directed to the lectern, because the lectern was what they offered you when they wanted you to have the standing, and she had not been offered it, and she was not going to wait for an offering she was not going to receive. She simply stood where speakers stood. She placed the petition on the floor at her feet, where everyone could see it existed, and she began. She spoke clearly and at a pace that gave every sentence room to arrive. She named the 60 acres by their local designation and by the hold's formal survey reference, because she had memorized both. She described the 4 seasons of absorption with specific seasonal markers. She cited the prior council minutes from the 3rd year of the absorption, which she had obtained from a secondary archive in the hold's outer library on the morning she arrived, because she had known from the petition structure that there were minutes, and that no one from Calwen had thought to look for them. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for sympathy. She spoke the way she always spoke when the stakes were real, as though the truth were a structure she was showing the council, and they were welcome to walk around it and examine it from any angle, because it would hold from all of them. She was 2 minutes into a presentation she had planned for 7 when Elder Voss interrupted. "The petition as submitted," he said, "does not carry the requisite secondary signature from a witness of ranked standing. A speaker of common birth bringing a petition without that signature has no procedural standing at this assembly. The petition is therefore not properly before this council." The hall went quiet. Nikolai looked at Voss with the particular attention she gave to things she needed to understand exactly. "The secondary signature requirement," she said, "was added to procedural law in the 4th year of the current council term. The petition was filed in the 2nd year. It carries the signature requirements that were in force at the time of filing." A pause moved through the room like weather. "You have the full procedural record," Voss said. It was not a question. "I have the relevant portions," Nikolai said. Voss's expression did not change in the way expressions change when someone is surprised. It changed in the way expressions change when someone has discovered that a calculation they considered reliable has a flaw in it, and they are not yet sure how large the flaw is. He said, still mildly, "The petition may be entered for review," which was not approval, which was also not a dismissal. In the vocabulary of council proceedings, it was the sound of a door being left slightly ajar. Nikolai gathered her petition from the floor and returned to her seat below the witness rail. She did not look at the Alpha King as she sat. She was composing the next version of the argument in her head, because entered for review meant she would have another opportunity, and she needed to know exactly what she would say when she had it. She did not see Soren lean toward the king's ear and say something in under 5 words. She did not see Calder's slight nod in return. She did not know, as she smoothed the petition across her knees again, that the instruction issued that evening concerning her fire and her water and her guards had been expanded to include her continued access to the Hold's outer library for as long as she remained a petition speaker in residence. She had no way to know any of it. She only knew the petition was still alive. Wren was waiting in the corridor, as she always was, 3 steps back and reading angles. "It didn't go badly," Wren said. "It went in the direction I needed it to go," Nikolai said. "Those are different things." She turned toward the library because she had 3 hours before the evening meal, and she intended to use them. She did not notice, until she was nearly at the library door, that the 2 guards who had materialized in the corridor behind her were wearing the Hold's formal detail colors, which were not colors that were typically assigned to common-born petitioners in residence. She noticed. She filed it. She opened the library door. The Hold's library was better than she had expected, and organized in a way that rewarded attention. And she was still at the table when a quiet sound behind her indicated that she was no longer alone. She did not immediately turn, because she was in the middle of a sentence in a council record from 9 years prior, and she had learned that whatever enters a room while you are reading will still be there when you finish the sentence. She finished the sentence. She looked up. The Alpha King of the Aaron Hold was standing in the library doorway, not in ceremony robes. In the plain, dark clothing of a man who has come somewhere without announcing himself, which she recognized as its own kind of statement. He was looking at the documents on the table rather than at her, which gave her 2 seconds to compose herself before he raised his eyes. "You cited minutes from the 3rd council term," he said. "The 4th-year signature requirement was retroactively applied in 3 prior cases," she said. "Those cases were resolved in the petitioner's favor. I wanted to understand why." "And?" "Because the secondary signature requirement was created to protect the council's record-keeping. When the petition predates the requirement, applying it retroactively protects nothing except the council's preference." A pause. Not the kind of pause that meant he was considering whether she was right. The kind that meant he had already decided and was determining what to do with the decision. "Your settlement is called Calwyn," he said. "Yes." "2 valleys east of the Terran Ridge." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with the petition. And then the moment was over, and he said, "The morning session will reconvene at the 3rd bell." And he left the doorway. She sat very still for the span of 3 full breaths. Then she returned to the record, because the morning session would reconvene at the 3rd bell and she was not finished. She noticed Marit at the morning session the way you notice a change in the weather before you can name the cloud. A woman of evident rank, seated in the reserved gallery above the council rail, with the composed air of someone who had not come for the petitions. Her attendants wore the color of the Draveth family, which was one of the 3 noble bloodlines with a formal bond claim in the council's current records. Nikolai had read about the bond claim in the library the previous night. Not because she had expected it to be relevant, but because she read everything that was in front of her. It had seemed theoretical then. She was beginning to understand that it was not theoretical. The morning session opened with 3 procedural announcements, and the 3rd of them was that the Aaron Council would be reviewing the criteria for a formal voice nomination before the end of the current assembly term. The voice of the court was the council's highest appointed speaking office, the person who carried the council's formal communications to the pack at large, who stood at the king's right in all public proceedings, whose word in assembly carried the weight of the council's collective record. Nikolai had known the position existed. She had not known until that moment that it was about to be filled. She understood immediately, watching Marit arrange her hands in her lap, why a woman with Draveth backing was present at an otherwise routine tribute assembly. Elder Voss called the session to order with the mild authority of a man who had organized outcomes before this one and expected this to be no different. The morning's first matter was a secondary petition from a hold merchant concerning a storage dispute, and Nikolai listened to it with part of her attention, while the rest of her was understanding the landscape. Maret was here because the council wanted her here. The voice nomination was on the council's agenda because Voss had put it there. The timeline would compress the tribute assembly's ordinary business around this particular outcome, which meant that Nikolai's petition, still entered for review, was at real risk of being administratively displaced. She had come for 60 acres of valley pasture. She was sitting in the middle of something considerably larger. Wren arrived at her shoulder during the merchant's closing statement. "The woman in the gallery," she said, barely above a breath. "Draveth family," Nikolai said equally quietly. "Voice candidate." Wren was quiet for 2 seconds. "Does that affect the petition?" "It affects the timeline." "What does that mean for us?" Nikolai looked at the petition in her hands. The 7 signatures on cured hide, 60 acres and 4 seasons, and the trust of people who had sent her forward because she was the one they could spare. "It means I need to finish this today," she said. When the merchant's matter concluded, Voss called for a recess and Nikolai rose and asked, in the formal register she reserved for procedural moments, whether the review of the Calwin petition might be scheduled before the council moved to the voice nomination process. Voss looked at her the way he had looked at her twice before, from the height of a man who has already calculated an outcome. "The Calwin petition," he said, "is entered for review and will be addressed in its proper order. A petition speaker of common birth does not set the council's schedule." The hall was not silent. It continued the low, ambient sound of people shifting in their seats and attendants moving along the walls. It was simply that the sentence landed on the floor between them with the particular weight of a thing said in public that cannot be unsaid. Nikolai did not look at the high seat. She said, "Respectfully, the petition has been in review for 24 hours and carries evidence from the council's own records. I would ask that it be addressed before new business is introduced, so that the speakers from Calwin who are waiting on its resolution might have an answer before the session closes." "The schedule," Voss said, "is the council's." "Of course," she said, and she sat. She did not look at the high seat. She should have. Because Soren, who was always watching, who noticed things the room did not know were being noticed, had turned his head very slightly toward the king, and something in the king's stillness had changed in a way that only Soren was positioned to see. The afternoon session was where it happened, and it happened in a way she had not anticipated, which meant she had failed to anticipate something, and she spent a portion of the evening examining exactly where her preparation had been insufficient. Voss opened the afternoon by placing the Calwin petition before the council for summary review. Summary review, she understood immediately, was a procedural designation that allowed the council to assess a petition's merit without extended testimony, which meant she was being given 3 minutes rather than 7, which meant she was going to need to be precise. She was precise. She gave them the survey reference and the council minutes and the prior cases, and the fact that the 60 acres had not been formally incorporated into the hold's ledger by the process that ledger incorporation required, only by a notational amendment that had no witness signatures of any kind. She said all of it in 2 minutes and 40 seconds and stopped. The council deliberated for 11 minutes. She counted. The decision was that the petition merited a full session review, which was not a grant and was not a refusal. It was a continuation. It meant she would need to remain in the hold through the next assembly session, which Voss announced would follow the completion of the voice nomination process. She understood what he had done. The nomination process would take as long as he needed it to take. The petition would be addressed afterward. And if the voice of the court were named before her petition was resolved, the new voice would carry significant influence over which petitions the council chose to prioritize. She looked at the petition in her hands. She looked at Mirette in the gallery. She had come for 60 acres of valley pasture, and she was sitting inside a machinery that had been running since before she arrived. Wren found her at the railing. She always found her. "You're doing the quiet thing," Wren said. "I'm thinking." "You think loudest when you're quiet." Wren stood beside her, looking out at the valley, the way she had learned to stand beside problems without making them larger. "She's very polished," she said, meaning Marit. "I watched her at the evening meal. She knows exactly which elder to speak to and for how long." "She's been preparing for this for longer than we've been here," Nikolai said. "Does she deserve it?" Nikolai considered the question the way she considered all questions, as though the answer mattered more than her comfort with it. "She's capable," she said. "She understands the council's language. She'll serve the hold adequately." "But," Wren said. Nikolai looked at the valley. The 60 acres were out there somewhere, in the dark, exactly where they had always been. "The voice of the court carries petitions to the pack at large," she said. "If that voice belongs to someone who was placed there by the Draveth family and Elder Voss, then the petitions it carries will carry their preferences, not the laws." Wren was quiet for a moment. "So you're not thinking about the petition?" "I'm thinking about both." She turned from the railing and found the Alpha King of the Aran Hold standing 20 feet behind her, having approached from the inner corridor without announcement, which she was beginning to understand was a habit of his. She did not know how long he had been there. She chose not to calculate it. "The valley," he said, nodding toward the view she had been looking at. "The valley," she agreed. He came to the railing and stood beside her at a distance that was formal and not. He looked out at the dark the way she had been looking at it, and for a moment they were simply two people looking at the same horizon, which was a thing that happened between people of equal station. "You could withdraw the petition," he said. "File it again in the next assembly term with the secondary signature in place. It would take longer, but the procedural path would be cleaner." She thought about that. She thought about the 7 signatures on cured hide and the people who had trusted her with their sole point of appeal. "It would take another full season," she said. "The Calwyn herds cannot sustain another season on the remaining pasture." "No," he said, quietly, not disagreeing with her. "Something else." A moment of stillness at the railing, the cold air moving between them, and then he said something he had not planned to say, and she could see the instant he heard himself say it, the instant he recognized the opening he had made in the formal distance he kept between himself and everyone. He said, "I have not heard someone speak in that hall the way you spoke today." She looked at him. He did not look at her. He looked at the valley. And then he said, as though correcting a line in a ledger, "Your petition will not be displaced by the nomination process." And he left the railing and walked back toward the inner corridor and did not pause at the door. She stood very still. The cold air continued to move. She was not sure, after a moment, what she had heard, whether the ledger correction was meant to cover the sentence before it, or whether they were two separate things. She suspected they were two separate things. She suspected he knew she suspected it. She looked out at the dark valley and decided to think about it in the morning, when she was less tired and the cold was not making her think strange things about the quality of a man's voice. If she had thought about it more carefully the night before, she would have identified it earlier. The additional observers. The way Voss opened the morning session with the practiced composure of a man who was managing a specific timeline. The way Marit was positioned not in the gallery this time, but in the floor's reserved standing area, where formal candidates were placed during nomination proceedings. The nomination right had been moved forward. Voss announced it at the morning session's opening, before any other business was addressed. The voice of the court nomination would proceed this morning, as circumstances had warranted an expedited process, and the formal rite of investiture would follow the council's selection if the Alpha King sanctioned the nomination. And then, in the same smooth procedural voice he used for everything, Voss announced that the petition from Calwen, having been entered for extended review, was suspended pending the completion of business now before the council. She looked at the petition. Wren was not in the hall yet. The morning had started before she had been able to send word. She looked at Voss. She looked at the council table. She looked at Maret, composed in the reserved standing area, wearing the pale gray of Draveth formal presentation. She looked finally at the high seat. Calder was watching the council table. His expression was what it always was. Still, attentive, and carrying something behind it that she had spent 4 days failing to read correctly. She rose. "If the speaker will be seated," Voss said, noting her without turning his full attention toward her. "The petition from Calwen was granted a full session review," she said, at the volume she used when she needed to be heard without raising her voice. "A full session review cannot be suspended by a procedural announcement without the consent of the petition speaker, under Council Procedural Code, as established in the 3rd year of the current term." The hall attended to her now. Voss looked at her with the expression she had come to understand as the end of his patience, which was different from most men's end of patience in that it was very controlled and very final. "A petition speaker of common birth," he said, in the particular measuring voice he used when he wanted a room to understand a distinction, "does not invoke procedural code on the floor of the Arryn Council. Sit down." She did not sit. "The procedural code does not carry a birth qualification," she said. "It was written to apply to all petition speakers in residence. I am in residence. The petition is under review. I am asking for the review to be completed before new business is introduced." "You are," Voss said, "out of order." "On what procedural ground?" "On the ground," he said, with a patience that was no longer patience, "that this council does not conduct its proceedings at the direction of common-born speakers who have no standing to compel its schedule, no ranked witness to their petition, and no authority in this hall beyond the courtesy of the seat they were given." He let the sentence finish and settle, and then he said, "The speaker from Calwen is barred from addressing this assembly until the current nomination business is complete. Guards." The guards did not touch her. They flanked her position, which was the same thing in the language of council authority. Wren appeared at the hall's side entrance at exactly the wrong moment, having come late to find Nikolai already standing and 2 guards at her sides, and the hall watching. Wren's face went through 3 things very quickly and arrived at controlled. Nikolai looked at her and shook her head. Very small. Wren stopped where she was. Voss turned to the council table and began the formal opening of the nomination proceedings, speaking Maret's full name and lineage and the Draveth family's sponsorship with the smooth pace of a man reading from a prepared text, because he was reading from a prepared text. Maret held herself with the composed grace of someone who had rehearsed this arrival. The council members received the nomination with the collegial attention of men who had been prepared to receive it. The high seat was very still. Nikolai was below the witness rail with 2 guards at her flanks and a petition in her hands that represented 60 acres and 7 families and the specific trust of people who had no other advocate. She was not going to speak. She had been formally barred from speaking. Voss had the procedural authority to bar her, and he had used it. And anything she said now would be framed as a disruption and used to remove her from the hall entirely, which would end the petition's chance of any hearing at all. She stood with her hands folded over the petition and watched the nomination proceed and did not speak. Voss began the investiture recitation. The 3 lamps at the table's edge were lit one by one, each accompanied by the name of the council member completing the step, and the formal language of the investiture moved through the hall in the practiced rhythm of a rite that had been performed many times. It was nearly ceremonial in its structure, nearly complete in its momentum. Nearly the kind of thing that, once begun, required extraordinary intervention to halt. The Alpha King of the Aaron Hold stood up. The hall did not go quiet because he made a sound. The hall went quiet because the hall had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for him to do something, and now he was doing it. And the particular quality of a room when the man at its center finally moves is different from every other kind of quiet. He stood at the high seat's edge for a moment. He looked at the 3 lit lamps on the council table. He looked at Moret. He looked at Voss. He said, "Stop." Voss turned to face the high seat with an expression that was not yet alarm, but was adjacent to it. "My lord, the investiture is in progress." "The investiture is incomplete," Calder said. "It requires my sanction to proceed." "The council's nomination is the first step. Your sanction follows upon the council's completion of the rite." "My sanction," Calder said, with the quiet of a man who does not need volume to carry authority, "does not follow automatically. It is given or withheld at my discretion. And I am telling you to stop." The hall held the silence. Calder descended from the high seat, which he had not done in the 4 days of the assembly. He came down the 3 stone steps from the dais and walked to the floor's center, which was where speakers stood when they needed to be heard, and he stopped there and turned to face the council table in full. "The voice of the court," he said in the carrying voice he used when he was done being patient, "serves the pack, all of it. Not the bloodlines that have the best gallery seats, not the families with the longest sponsorship histories. The pack, every settlement in this Hold's territory, every petition that reaches this floor on their behalf." He looked at Voss. "Including the one that has been before this council for 5 days and been interrupted 3 times by a man who has decided that the speaker bringing it does not deserve a ruling because of how she was born." Voss's expression had made its full journey from adjacent to alarm to something older and less controlled. "My lord, the Draveth nomination represents the council's considered. The council's consideration, me," Calder said, "was not asked. The voice of the court is a position I sanction. The council nominates. I sanction. I am declining to sanction this nomination." He paused. He looked across the hall, not at the council table. He looked below the witness rail. "And I am naming a candidate of my own." He said her name. He said it the way you say a name when you need the room to understand that you mean it precisely and not approximately, that the name is a specific person you have been watching for 5 days and have not looked away from, and the room needs to understand that looking away from her is no longer available to them. He said, "Nikolai Windrider, speaker from Calwen, come and stand here." She had, in her life, been in rooms where everything changed. She knew the quality of it. She knew the way the air rearranges itself when a decision that cannot be unmade has been made, when something that was true a moment ago is no longer true, and everything built on it has to reorganize around a new fact. She looked at Calder standing on the floor's center. She looked at the petition in her hands. She walked from below the witness rail to the floor's center and stood. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had looked at her at the railing in the cold, and then he looked at the council table. "This," he said, "is the voice I am naming. A woman who has stood in this hall for 5 days with evidence that your own records confirm, who has been interrupted, dismissed, seated below the rail, and formally barred from speaking by a man who decided her birth mattered more than her argument, and who has not, at any point, behaved in a way that this council or this position could not claim as its own." Voss found his voice. The procedural law governing voice nomination has a king's prerogative provision, Calder said, "which I am exercising, as is my right, as has always been my right, which you would know, Elder Voss, if you had not become accustomed to proceeding as though my sanction were a formality." The silence in the hall was the kind that lands after something has shattered, not with violence, but with weight. Voss opened his mouth and closed it. One of the council members, the eldest of the seven, a woman named Dura, who had sat through the entire assembly with the patience of someone waiting to see how a river ran, said quietly, "The king's prerogative provision is valid. I have reviewed it." That was the sound of Voss's structural support leaving the table. He looked at Nikolai. He looked at Calder. He said nothing. Calder turned to Nikolai, and here, close, she could see the cost of what he had just done, the alliance he had declined to broker, the faction he had declined to accommodate, the political capital he had spent in 5 words, and the fact that he appeared to have calculated it in advance and found it an acceptable expenditure. He said quietly, "If you are willing." She had never been asked by a king. She had 7 signatures on cured hide in her hands. She thought about Wren in the doorway, steady, waiting. She thought about the 60 acres of valley pasture and the herds that needed them, and the specific trust of people who had sent her forward because she was the one they could spare. And she thought about what a voice of the court, who had come from Calwen, who knew what petitions from ordinary settlements cost the people who filed them, might mean for every ordinary settlement that would come after her. She said, "Yes." The formal naming took the time it needed to take. There was procedural language, which Calder delivered in the full voice of his authority. There was the council's acknowledgement, which came from Dura first and then from 5 others, and finally, with the contained expression of a man being made to acknowledge something he will not forget, from Voss. Marat received her release from the nomination with the composure of a woman who had been prepared for contingencies, and she gathered her attendants and departed the hall with a quietness that carried its own dignity. Nikolai did not watch her go. She was listening to the procedural language and understanding that each sentence was changing what she was. Voss resigned his council seat the following morning. He submitted the resignation in writing, as the procedural law required, and the resignation was accepted with the same formal quiet that the council had used to close the naming. The eldest elder Dura assumed the chair. The Calwen petition was the first matter she brought before the new session, and she addressed it in 40 minutes and ruled in Calwen's favor. And the ruling was entered into the official record with all appropriate witness signatures. When the ruling was announced, Nikolai did not allow herself the expression that wanted to cross her face until she was in the corridor, where Wren was waiting with the particular intensity of someone who has been holding a feeling for several hours. 60 acres, Wren said. 60 acres, Nikolai confirmed. Wren made a sound that was not quite a word, and found Nikolai's arm with both hands and held it, and Nikolai stood still and let herself be held for the span of a few breaths, because sometimes the thing you came for arrives, and you need a moment to let it be real. Soren found her in the corridor an hour later, with the manner of a man who has been sent on a task he is glad to perform. He said that the king's formal schedule the following morning included the public presentation of the new voice of the court, and that she was invited to present herself at the Hold's great entry hall at the second bell. He said it in the way of a man delivering an official communication, and then he said, in a different register, quieter, "He decided the day after you cited those council minutes." She looked at him. "I notice things," Soren said, with the small contained quality of a man acknowledging a professional habit, and left the corridor. The Hold's great entry hall was wider than the assembly hall, and built differently, without the compression of those vaulted ceilings, built instead to expand outward, to hold more people, to let sound carry in all directions. The assembled pack filled it side to side. There were faces she recognized from the assembly sessions and faces she had not seen, and there were wolves who had come from within the Hold's inner territory, who had the manner of people accustomed to watching public proceedings from the inside rather than the outside. Wren was in the crowd, 3 rows back, with the alert and steady expression of someone who had arranged herself where she could see clearly. Calder was standing at the raised stone step before the central arch, which was not the high seat. It was not elevated by ceremony. It was simply the hall's center, and he stood there with the same quality he carried everywhere. The quality of a man who did not need the height. Nikolai walked to stand beside him, because that was where the voice of the court stood. He introduced her to the pack in the formal language of the position, her name, her settlement, her appointment, the king's prerogative provision that had established it. He spoke clearly and gave every sentence room to land, and she recognized, with a faint wry awareness she kept entirely inside her chest, that he spoke publicly the way she did, which was the way you spoke when you needed the words to carry. When he finished, Soren was the first to bow. The ripple moved through the hall in the way acknowledgement moves when it is genuine, not the performed compliance of people obeying a command, but the registered response of people who have heard something true and recognized it. Not everyone in the hall had witnessed the assembly sessions. Not everyone had heard her stand below the witness rail and cite council minutes, while 2 guards flanked her position, and Voss told the room she had no right to speak. Some of them were acknowledging a title they had just learned. Some of them were acknowledging something older, the specific recognition that the hall's hierarchy had been adjusted in the direction of accuracy. After, the formal proceedings dispersed and the hall thinned, and Calder remained at the stone step, and she remained beside him because she was the voice of the court, and that was where the voice stood. "Your petition is resolved," he said. "Yes. Thank you." He looked out at the emptying hall. "The next assembly term begins in 2 months. There will be other petitions." "Yes," she said. "There will." He looked at her then, the full attention he had given her in the library when she had not been able to look directly back at it. He was closer than he had been at the railing. The ceremonial noise of the hall had thinned around them until there was only the ambient sound of stone and a few remaining attendants and the distant voices of the pack dispersing into the hold's corridors. "The position is yours for as long as you want it," he said. She considered that. She considered everything it carried: the council chamber, the high seat's right hand, the weight of the pack's petitions, the 60 acres that would feed the Calwyn herds while she stood here. She considered the 7 signatures on cured hide, which had carried her to this hall, and which had become something she had not known she was arriving to find. "I want it," she said. It was not a ceremony. It was not a claiming in the way the packs told those stories, with fire and witnesses and formal words that bound. It was simply 2 people at a stone step in an emptying hall, and the truth she spoke was the same kind of truth she had always spoken, plain and exact, and not dressed for the room. She had learned, in 16 years of speaking for people who needed a voice, that the most important thing she could say in any given moment was the thing she actually meant. Wren was still there, 3 rows back, watching with the particular expression she wore when she was recording something in the part of herself that kept records. The expression she would carry for years as the specific image of a morning in a stone hall in the Aran Hold, when everything Nikolai had spent 16 years building had arrived at a place it could stand. Calder's hand rested open on the stone step beside hers. Not touching. Present. The way a hand rests when it is waiting to be answered rather than demanding to be taken. She rested her hand beside his. She looked at the hall's high windows, where the morning light was arriving at the angle that said the day had not yet chosen its character, that anything might still be decided, that the world was not yet fixed in its understanding of who she was, or what this stone room would hold. She knew. The hall held. She had come to this hold for 60 acres, and for the trust of people who had sent her forward with a petition and a single instruction. Say what is true. She had said what was true. Every time, in every room, at every cost, the world at last had arranged itself around the fact of her.